Hello, this is Dr. Mike, and this is lecture 4 of week 1 of Philosophy 300. Today, we're going to talk about God, and I would caution you to realize that you can talk about religion and God as an academic subject without being personally involved. And sometimes we have to kind of separate our beliefs, our personal religious beliefs from the academic subject, and not try to impose our beliefs on other people. And that's kind of where I come into, you've heard me say that I was a pastor for 20 years. And so I do try to separate the things that I believe personally from the discussion, even though some of that's not quite possible because we're guided by our own feelings and thoughts and who we are. It is our worldview that comes across that we have that we don't expect everybody else to have, but we do know that Westerners, which we're considered Westerners, do have a particular worldview that comes all the way back from the Greeks up to the present day, and that the great monotheistic religions, not just Christianity, but Islam and Judaism, are all come from the same roots of that. There was a time when they were all called the people of the book, meaning that we all came, our religious evolution came out of the Old Testament by the founding patriarch Abraham. And so all three world religions can be traced back to him. There was a time when you could live in a Muslim country as a Christian or a Jew in peace. You might pay a religious tax to be there, but I mean, you could live in Tehran, in Iran, long before. Lots of things politically have happened that have poisoned that water and made it nigh onto impossible. We know that a lot of the world's warfares are caused by that, and so there's a lot of feelings about that. So basically, I want to, in this section, give you some generic thoughts about the Western philosophy, which is what we're discussing, and the concept of God and how that evolves and how that may work in our lives. If you believe in God, doesn't matter what kind of God it is or what kind of religion it is, then you're known as a theist. A theist is a person who does accept that there is a God. If you don't know, you're considered to be an agnostic. And if you don't believe in God, you're considered to be an atheist. Now, I would probably argue the point that even agnosticism or atheism are religions in themselves. The absence of religion is a religion when you practice it, because it is the way of doing things. And as I told you, my grandmother would always say, even the mule has religion. It has a way of doing things. So those are things that we think about. When we think about religion and God, we think about some very prominent features. And this question is just as important if you are an agnostic or an atheist than if you were a theist. It's important to know what it is you don't believe or you don't know. So think about that for a moment. It's one thing as a believer to say, I want to know these things, but it's equally important if you don't believe or you're unsure, then you want to ask the same questions. Even if you believe in God, there may be some concepts of God you don't believe in, so you don't have to accept every piece of that puzzle. For example, perhaps you don't believe in a fatherly God who looks after us, but you do believe in some vital force or a prime mover that got the universe going in the first place. Let me give you an example of people that believe that. In the founding of the United States, we often argue over whether we had a Christian founding in America or not. And while the founders certainly used Christian principles in thinking about what America was going to be in the United States, many of the people that were in that meeting, in the writing of the Declaration of Independence and the writing of the American Constitution, were not conventional Christians in the sense that we probably imagine them to be. And you've got to remember that in history is a weapon. It's used politically. but people conceive of history in lots of different ways. I've done a lot of work on Thomas Jefferson recently for my PhD, and Jefferson was the man who penned, the most part, the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson was not a conventional Christian. He was not a Baptist, Methodist, Roman Catholic. He was, in some sense, a deist. And the deist is a person that believes in what was called the watchmaker of God, that God created the world, that he wound it up with a certain amount of energy, and he spun it off, and that he never had any further contact or direction in the way the world went. In other words, there's a definite amount of energy in our solar system, and we are in the process of winding down. And there are some points that you can make to see that. Interesting thing about Thomas Jefferson was that when he wrote the Constitution, he mentioned the name of God and providence over and over and over. When you read something like that, you don't just take it face value and say, oh, he was a believer, he was a Christian. You have to go in and get the dictionary out that he was using to see how he defined those words. And when he mentions the God of providence or the God of creation or whatever, he was, in his mind, he was thinking about that theistic God who started the world and left it to his own devices. He did do a great deal of work on protecting religious freedom, though. So he wasn't, you don't just paint someone a certain way and then abandon the paintbrush. But Benjamin Franklin was another deist, very strong deist. Jefferson didn't remain a deist. He literally became a Unitarian at the end of his life, believed in one God, but not God, the Son, of the Holy Spirit. Didn't believe in the Trinity that is taught by most Christian denominations. Franklin remained a deist all of his life and was a scientist and philosopher and many other things, but he was very different sort. There were but one or two, maybe three of them. Well, three, I guess. Thomas Paine was another who wrote the booklet that caused us to change the common man's ideas about the Revolutionary War. The rest of them were any Duke's mixture of belief. Some of them very strong Christians in the conventional sense. And then, of course, you had the deists that were thrown in. But you always kind of look at the dictionary they're using to see how they define those words. There are things about the concept of God that we're always talking about. We talk about his being all-powerful or his omnipotence, his being all-knowing, that he is omniscient, or that did God create the universe, or does God care about human beings, or does God have emotions? And if he does, which ones does he have? Does he love? Is he jealous? Is he angered? Is he hate? Is there hatred in God? Is there vengeance? Go back and look at the concepts of God before there ever was creation or Christianity, and you will see that these are the same questions that the Greeks asked in the early days about the gods that they believed in, who certainly were not Judeo-Christian gods, but they believed in Zeus and Thor and Jupiter. And these gods did have emotions. They exhibited love and anger and hatred. They fell in love. They were capricious. They did things and had children with each other. They were a reflection of the human traits that were going on in those ancient societies. And you will find that when you talk about gods and all these things in these societies, many times before the Judeo-Christian came along, they were reflections of real humans. And that if God made them, then they made them like themselves. And so we were capricious, we love, we hate, we have compassion, all of those things. And so a lot of these philosophical questions you will find attempting to be answered by different people. Søren Kierkegaard was probably one of the most important philosophers of modern times. He came up with the idea of existentialism. He wrote, he lived his whole life in Copenhagen and wrote from there without having ever seen the world. But he came up with this idea that said to be a Christian, he believed that it meant to be, to take a leap of faith, as he called it. Faith is something personal, not a matter of doctrine or social groups or ceremonies. And I particularly kind of like that idea, is that, today we equate religion with being a member of a church or denomination, but this idea of faith being a personal thing is probably much more in the spirit of Jesus in the Bible, and not, well, I'm a member of this church or that church. So in most philosophies, Western philosophies, the idea of God is one of the most is the most single concerns of any other thing, that we believe in God or don't believe in God. We think in the West usually that it is God that makes the most sense, who gives life meaning. And if we believe that life ought to be fair, for example, many thinkers would think that's important, to believe that there is some powerful being who will make things come out in some fair way in the end. If not in this life, then in another. That is kind of the encapsulated version of Western thought. Now, let me give you an example of that I always go back to. Elie Wiesel, who's also known as the Nazi hunter, was a Jewish person who went to the Nazi concentration camps when he was 6 years old, and he survived. Jewish people do not believe in a hell or punishment in the next life, and that's really quite interesting. But they asked Elie Wiesel once. He was an old man, and in fact, I was going to hear him speak personally. I never met him. He was 97. I hope to go hear him speak in an event in my hometown, and he canceled the meeting, and then shortly thereafter died before I got to ever hear him. But I really was looking forward to hearing him. But in an interview, they asked Elie Wiesel. Now remember, Jewish people don't necessarily believe there is a hell, but they asked him, they said, "Do you believe in hell?" And he had chased Nazis all of his life and brought many of them to justice for the Holocaust and what they had done to Jewish people. And this was Elie Wiesel's answer. He said, "I think there has to be, because there has to be a place somewhere in the universe where these great evils are made right and people are brought to justice that escape it." And that was his answer. So you can take that for what it's worth and give some thought to that. But the existence of a God is central to the idea of the philosophy of religion. I'll never forget 1975 when I started studying psychology for my major and philosophy for my minor, standing in Spurgeon Cole's class at Clemson University in front of a class probably of 150 students. And it was a psychology of religion. And this was his opening statement, first statement. He said, "There are two fields that attract more nuts than any other two fields. One of them is religion and the other is psychology. They come to psychology hoping to figure out why they're so screwed up, and they come to religion hoping they can find a way out of it in the next life." And so, that's kind of humorous when you think about the number of nuts that we run across in life. I found that as a pastor. When I was pastoring, every nut in town came to my church, but they were always looking for understanding of themselves. And that's what philosophy really boils down to when you think about it. How do we understand ourselves? Why do we have this tendency toward religion or spirituality? I think there's a difference between being spiritual and being religious. But I think if it's real, and a lot of people's are not, the reality is that it changes you into a better person. So, there is a difference in believing that God exists and that, believe in God itself. So as you read through this, the book talks about a very interesting person I want to mention to you, and that was Voltaire. Voltaire was one of the leading philosophers of the Enlightenment that came along in the 1700s. And the Enlightenment promoted the use of reason over faith. Now, it's really difficult for us to grasp this because we're looking back, but you realize how people made decisions before the 1700s was basically on faith. If something bad happened, it was because God sent that plague or that storm or allowed that person to be killed. It was all about faith. And so they believed in God, trusted in God, never asked too many questions beyond that. In fact, to ask questions about some event like that would be to be questioning God's authority and his omnipotence and his omniscience. And so it just wasn't done. In the 1700s, along came these guys that believed reason was the right way to make a decision and not faith. And they questioned everything. They applied everything to reason. And finally, in the 1800s, they applied the Bible to reason. And Voltaire was one of these philosophers of the French Enlightenment. He was a skilled critic, a dedicated political reformer, and he was, his religion would probably have been more like Jefferson or Franklin as a deist. In fact, he made this very interesting statement once. He said, in 100 years, and he had these salons, which was a French thing on Friday evening, where all the learned people came to his house and they sat around and discussed all these things like you and I are doing today. But he made this statement. He said, in 100 years, he said, no one will remember the Bible. In 100 years, all they'll remember is Voltaire. Well, interestingly enough, 100 years from the day when he made that statement, he was dead and almost forgotten. And they were printing Bibles in the basement of his house because his house had been bought by the American Bible Society. So, it's one thing to make those claims and bluffs, but you don't have any control over that. He rejected Christianity as an institution and often bragged that he was tired of hearing about how the Christian church had been established by only 12 men, and that he would like to show that a single man could destroy it. And so that was his goal. So if we go back to the Greeks and Romans, there was no Christianity then, and there was no, Judaism barely starting then. But there were gods and goddesses, and they were looked upon as divine of sort. More for the Greeks and Romans, more half human, half divine, maybe. Some of them had cohabitated with humans, and so they were half and half. And so it made a big difference in how they functioned. Western, starting with the Greeks, the Western world always attributed anthropomorphic characteristics to God. He was always a man, always white, and always spoke and walked and talked. So they attributed these traits to him that were human. He had emotions. He thought. He was, all those things. So when you read through this, you'll understand, that religion changes over time. It will go through this the synthesis process, and where you will adapt a lot of all of those things in the past religion into the present religion. I'll give you an example of that. 476, Rome falls to the barbarians. 431, Rome, or 491, 391. Christianity was named as the official religion of the Roman Empire. And they were Romans who still worship their gods like Jupiter and Zeus and all the ones you'll see them listed for you in the book and tell you what their function was. They still worship these old pagan gods. And so in order to get the pagans to come to church, the Catholic Church merged many of the holidays of paganism with Christianity. For example, October 31st, Halloween, All Hallows Eve was a pagan holiday. You still hear that sometimes talked about, but it was also All Saints Day. So the Catholic Church blended those together, and so the pagans could come to church for whatever reason, and they'd be there for the All Saints Day. Christmas is another one. It was not likely, if you go by the text of the New Testament, that shepherds were in the fields on December the 25th. That was dead of winter, and they didn't take their sheep out to the spring. But on December 25th was the Roman holiday, the Saturnalia, the sun. And so they made that the day that Christ supposedly was born, or Jesus was born, and blended those holidays. there's a lot of paganism in the Christian church. When people came over from England for the first time, they brought this belief in witches and witchcraft with them that ended up in the Salem witch trials. So that's just some things to think about as you're reading through here. The Western view of God is that he is transcendent. He lives across the ages or beyond the ordinary world of human experience, outside of ourselves, distinct from the world, and that God created as an outsider. God stood, as Genesis would say, on the edge and spoke the world into existence. He was not in the world, a part of the world. He was the other. He was a divine other. God's immanent, and you'll see that that basically means that God's in things. He is God. God is inhabiting our body in the spirit. There are degrees of that get beyond Christian thought, like pantheism. God is in everything. He's in this chair that I sit in, the desk, the computer, all those things. But there are religions that would practice that. So it's really, really interesting. So those are just some general Western views. Pantheism then would be that God is in everything. And then there are some other comments in the book that are really good to read about other religions, other alternatives like Buddhism and Zen Buddhism and how they came about and what they believe. There's one major point that I will make about Western and Eastern religions. As I said, every civilization will have a religion. Eastern religions are much more circular. They don't look at history the way we do in the West. And this came from the ancient Jews, that we look at history as a beginning, a middle, and an end, that there is a past, a present, and a future. And this is what gave Western thought so much hope that there is a future, that we're going somewhere, that we're making progress, that we're on this continuum, that we're working on that. Sometimes when we look around us today, we kind of lose hope in that because it doesn't look like we're making progress. But in the East, it's circular. They don't believe in an afterlife. They don't have a book as like a Bible to live by. But when you die, you accumulate karma while you're alive. And if you do good things, that karma will help you in the next life. You'll come back in a higher level of being. And if you keep doing that, you will eventually approach nirvana and become one with the energy of the universe. It's not a heaven as much as it is just to stop recreating, reviving. It's called reincarnation. You're reincarnated ever as a higher and higher being. There's a couple of things that I always talk about when I talk about that. The Buddhists believe that everything that has a life force, that is a sentient being, is made by God and should be respected and not killed. There was a movie years ago called Karate Girl, and she ended up staying for a time at a Buddhist monastery. And one day she killed a cockroach with her shoe and created this great big mess with all the Buddhist priests, who were greatly offended that she had wiped out the sentient being of a cockroach. I was coming home from church one Sunday morning, and this car had stopped dead in the road in front of me. It was a Toyota car, had their flashers on, and this elderly Asian couple had gotten out of their car. It had been a squirrel that had been hit by another car. It was still laying in the road, still moving. And that old couple had taken a piece of paper and very gently slid it under the squirrel and moved the squirrel to the side of the road where it wouldn't continue to be abused by other cars hitting it. And I thought that's a great example of the Buddhist view of the importance of life and how that we take care of things. Other people look at God in a universal sense, that God is everywhere, that he is moving our process. The philosopher Hegel talks about the spirit moving in the world, that there's a transcend, that he actually inhabits human beings, and that God is moral. All these thoughts you'll be looking at. Another thought that this chapter entails is the idea of the problem of evil. And good and evil are really present in every religion that I can think of. And of course, in the Western view, there is the counterpart of the devil, who is the arch, nemesis of God. And so they're in this titanic struggle between good and evil, and see who's going to win out and win the cosmos, and they will rule. So, and then there's more than one kind of evil. There's moral evil, and then there's just general evil. And so those are things that you'll read about, and I think you'll find a lot of this to be very, very, very interesting. Also, the idea of free will always comes up in this discussion as to are we puppets? If there is a God, that he made the universe, that he made humanity, are we puppets just enforced to do his bidding, or do we have free will to act upon our own and to pay consequences if there are? And I think the biblical view is that that we are free, and that we pay the price for our own decisions, whether they be good or bad. And so there's always a reckoning time. So when you think about believing and belief, there's all kind of arguments to that he mentions. And this is a great chapter, starting with verse 87, talks about Sir Thomas Aquinas, who was a Catholic prelate who wrote about this in the 12th century. He was a philosopher of some merit, and he talked about the different arguments for believing. What are those arguments? Remember, we talk about going into a courtroom, and we would present to a jury that we're going to defend the right to believe in God. And what are your arguments going to be? Well, he mentions several of those. The cosmological argument is interesting because it has a lot of variations. But the simplest one is this: everything has to be caused by or created from something else. Therefore, there must have been a first cause, or what Aristotle called a prime mover, and that first cause is God. So think about that. It's a cosmological argument that if everything is created from something else, we don't have spontaneous generation of anything on the planet. So everything came from something else. So if you move back far enough, then the cosmological statement is there must be a prime mover or a first mover, which had to be God who started things. And so that would be considered an argument for belief. The other one, which is probably even more weighty, is the argument from design, that drawing the analogy between our finding a watch in a field and assuming that some person must have been there, we see the intricate design of the watch and realize that just didn't happen. The evolutionist says that the Earth started with a big bang, and so everything evolved from that. But even Charles Darwin, who invented the theory of evolution, said there was one thing that really bothered him when it came to evolution, and that was the human eye, because the human eye is the most perfect instrument on the planet. And he said the idea that could have come from a big bang and randomly evolved into the human eye is nigh on to impossible. You realize when you look through a telescope at the universe that there's just as much order out there as there is if you take a microscope and you look at the very small things. We find the same random order. And the question that is asked then, how can that be by accident? How could that order have come out of the chaos of a big bang? So those are the arguments that most people who argue for the question of is there a God would look at. The other is the ontological argument that focuses on rational belief in God's existence, that there was reason for that we cannot conceive of God except as infinite and perfect, but it has to do with something with the nature of existence. And the argument, which has been developed in hundreds of variations, is this: and being all who had all perfections, justice, omnipotence, omniscience, and so on, except for the perfection of existence, would not be most perfect. Therefore, the most perfect is God himself, and he exists there. So, and so you read through this chapter, you'll find, I think, a lot of things that will, the idea of rational faith and irrational faith comes up as the final thing that I want to talk to you about. And what is rational faith and what is irrational? If I ask you if you believe something, many would say that they don't believe in Christianity because of the exceptions to the rule. Well, this preacher or that church or this over here or that over there. That's not what I'm asking you. You're going to always have these irrationalities in any faith. In religious studies, we talk about religion having a center, and then you have this periphery of things that go along with that. So if the center is, say, Bible Christianity, and we go back and look at first century with Paul and Jesus, then you've got all of these external peripheries of religions that have developed from the center. Mormonism, 1800s, all kinds of stuff, the Oneida Fellowship in New York. And then you've got all these denominations that are in there. The further they are from the center, the more irrational they become. You have people that all they preach are doomsday prophecies, and people that preach all they preach is give me your money and I'll give you a miracle. Those are way, way out on the periphery, way away from the central teachings of the religion. And those are the ones we tend to use as excuses for not believing. But then you have rational faith, somebody like Mother Teresa, who gave her life working for the lepers in India, who never amassed anything but the clothes she had on her back. And we look at her and say, wow, that's a true example of what a follower of Christ would be found doing. She's not some charlatan raising money, not someone trying to practice polygamy or any of the other things. So as you read about irrational and rational faith, think about that. Of course, then the idea of religious tolerance, that, give people the freedom to make their own choices as far as God or whether they do or not. You have that personal choice. That is your bailiwick. But don't be condemning of others who do make the choice. That is their choice to have faith, to believe. They have gone through this process of asking the questions that we have, and maybe they come to different answers. Give them the freedom to have different answers than yours. And don't be intolerant. When I look at a Muslim family and see a mother with a hijab on her head, the kerchief, the head covering, I'm not to criticize or condemn her for her religious belief. I mean, there are a lot of Christians, women that believe that God commands them to have a head covering. So they'll wear a kerchief. I was preaching in the Ukraine of all places in 1990, 45 degrees below zero. We were in a barn that night with 300 people underground under communist Russia. And I had a Seventh-day Adventist lady who was translating for me. And we're sitting on the platform and she said, oh, I forgot. It was the Baptist custom that a woman has to have a head covering to stand in the pulpit. So she left the platform, borrowed someone's kerchief, put it around her head, came back, and she was fine. That was a personal belief. That's not the Baptist belief in America. But there are people in Christianity who believe the same thing. So why should we judge a Muslim lady for wearing a head covering? That's something that's kind of silly. It's kind of like, judging some lady for wearing pants. And that was a big deal in the Baptist church, or a man's hair touching his ears, or a man having beards or whatever. Those are very, very minimal things. And it takes away from, maybe you don't join organized religion, but why should that have anything to do with personal belief? I'd be glad to answer any questions you have. If you want to email me or send me a text, I would be glad to engage in questions. This is a hard subject to talk about without being personal religion, but it is very much at the heart of philosophy. And I do not in any way mean to offend you, hurt your feelings. I'm just trying to get you to think about things that are a part of our Western heritage. And just remember that everybody on the planet has some kind of religion. You say, well, I'm an atheist, I'm an agnostic. That is a religion in itself. It's a way of doing things, a way of believing things. So you do have a religion, whether you acknowledge that religion or not. And it's really interesting. The atheist religion was quite interesting. There's a lady in the 60s who succeeded in getting prayer and Bible reading taken out of the schools. And her name was Madeline Murray O'Hare. And she had quite a large following of people that were atheists that actually practiced. And they had a 501c3 tax deduction and everything. So they were quite a part of it. Thank you for listening today. I hope something that was said will be meaningful, helpful. And as I said, I'm more than happy to engage in any conversation that you would like us to engage in. And I can do a video of just questions. So let me know.